As a responsible person with growing concerns for your privacy and personal liberty, you want to know where we're headed and what you can do about it. We ask the experts what you need to do to take prudent and responsible action to safeguard your family's wealth and well-being, and what basic first steps will help you to be aware and prepared. ReluctantPreppers.com.
Welcome back, Reluctant Preppers. We have a returning guest tonight. John Rubino, founder of thedollarcollapse.com, is here with us on Reluctant Preppers again. He's here with us to talk about what life is like now and where we see increased risk and volatility, where the action has been following the historic election of Donald Trump as U.S. president. John, welcome back to Reluctant Preppers.
Hi, Dunnigan. Good to talk to you again.
Now, I've noticed on your website, on your top 10 videos, there was an interview with Edward Snowden about the surveillance state and the loss of privacy, but what the new technology era and encryption technology can possibly open up as far as enabling more freedom, more liberty, and more privacy for individuals. But that's one topic we'd like to touch on, but I'd like to get kind of a broad brush from you before we get into that on what's going on in the world around us economically, especially in the eventful weeks that we're just 1 week past the election of Donald Trump here. And what are you seeing affecting the global markets, both if you could give us a view politically, economically, across the different market factors that you watch on the dollar collapse?
Well, it's all tied together because 30 or 40 years ago, we decided to start taking on huge amounts of debt and not paying that debt off, just building up more and more debt. Now, in an individual's life or a family life, if you do that, if you borrow too much money, your life spins out of control, right? And it works the same way for countries, although a big branch of economics, mostly Keynesianism, doesn't see it that way. You know, they think the fact that a government has a printing press makes it immune to the forces that normally affect people, for instance, who borrow too much money. But that's not the case. When a country borrows too much money, things get harder and politics gets messier. And eventually you get a crash that wipes out the old system and gives you a chance to re-imprint something on this blank slate and start over. We're in that process. We're deeply into that process now, where most of the major countries of the world have borrowed more money than they can ever hope to pay off, and just don't have that much left over now to manage elections and buy off constituencies and make sure everybody's getting something that they want. So you've got more and more dissatisfied people who feel like the system isn't working for them, and therefore are more and more likely and willing to vote for iconoclasts, outsiders who promise to tear the system down and acknowledge that the system isn't working. You know, and that's what Donald Trump is. There have been very few other elections where he would have gotten more than 5% of the vote. But this time around, he was speaking the language of huge sections of the U.S. Rust Belt and lots of other disaffected people around the country, because the system really is broken and it really is set up by the rich for the rich. And it completely ignores the, let's say, the unprotected class, the 95% of the people in the country who don't make the rules and have to live under the rules as defined by factory owners and the political class and rich symbol manipulators who see, for instance, open borders as an increase in the supply of cheap nannies and gardeners and cheap factory workers that can't complain about working conditions or low pay or anything. So it's good for them.
And dependent voters who will re-elect you.
Yes. Yeah. I mean, the Democrats like open borders and largely free immigration because a lot of recent immigrants tend to vote Democrat. The Republicans like immigration because, like I said, it's cheap factory work, you know, and it makes more money for them. But they don't live in the neighborhoods where their factory workers live, so they don't see the neighborhood changing. But if you live there, then for you, immigration means the house down the street with 19 people living in it, you know, or a lot of young guys wearing gang tattoos and doing scary things. So your life is changing in a negative way. while the guys who are just leaving the border open and not bothering to enforce immigration laws are benefiting from it. They're liking what's happening, so they see no reason to change it. Same thing with free trade. For a rich guy, free trade means his stock portfolio is going up, or a chance to outsource work to China and then ship stuff back to the U.S. at 10 or 15 or 20% less and make more money that way. But for the factory worker whose factory closes down and is thrown out of work and then it has nowhere else to go but McDonald's or Walmart, free trade is not a good deal. So Trump was speaking to the people who are in the unprotected class now, and they listened. The unprotected class heard what he was saying and voted for him in numbers that were big enough to make Donald Trump the president. So the Democrats have to decide what kind of a party they are. They had become the party of technocrats. They were free traders and basically speaking lately, at least, to Silicon Valley entrepreneurs and well-off gay couples. People like that who are completely good groups. They're good people, but they aren't the core constituency that the Democrats originally had in the days of, for instance, FDR. So the Democrats have to decide whether they want to get back to to their roots and become, Bernie Sanders followers, or stay with the Clinton-esque, middle-of-the-road, technocratic mindset, and then leave that, the Trump voters for somebody else. I'm not sure what they'll do. But the important thing is that this isn't just a U.S. phenomenon. It's the same thing all around the world. In Europe now, immigration is the way it is in the U.S., but on steroids. There are people in every major European country who are just freaked by the level of immigration and by the lack of assimilation on the part of recent immigrants. And so they're willing to vote for people who are, in effect, Donald Trumps of their own country. Marine Le Pen in France, for instance, is the most popular politician right now in France and has a real shot at becoming the next president. And her party, the National Front, was considered kind of neo-fascist a couple of decades ago. They've been cleaning it up, but it still has a lot of the right-wing attitudes that don't normally play well in an extremely liberal country like France. But here she is, becoming more popular all the time for the same reasons that Donald Trump is popular here in the U.S. And then Nigel Farage in Great Britain, and Beppe Grillo in Italy, and Podemos, the political party of the far left in Spain. These guys are all rising at the expense of the old mainstream parties. So political turmoil is everywhere now, and you can trace it back to our stupid finances. If we hadn't broken the last vestige of a link between the world's fiat currencies and gold in 1971, we wouldn't be in this mess. But we did, and in effect, we handed every major country an unlimited credit card. They could print as much new currency as they wanted to, and there was no mechanism by which people could then turn in their currency to get gold and force the country to slow down its currency creation. So since that time, everybody has just spent whatever they want, borrowed whatever they needed to do to cover their spending, created as much new currency as it takes to pay off the debt, and debt has soared. Global debt almost blew up the financial system in 2008, 2009. We had a near-death experience. But instead of learning from that, we just put the pedal to the metal in response to the crisis, and we added something like now $100 trillion of new debt. It depends on how you define debt, but a couple of years ago, McKinsey & Company consultancy calculated that $57 trillion of official debt had been added in the 5 years since 2009. Well, since that time, we have been adding even more debt, especially if you count unfunded liabilities of pension plans, which are just through the roof. So I think the $100 trillion number is not unrealistic now. So basically, we took an over-indebted system that was near death and leveraged it even further. So we've got financial issues everywhere you look because of this, and a huge crisis looming, and people's lives getting harder and harder because either they've borrowed too much money, or their state and local government or their national government borrowed too much money, and stuff that used to be easy isn't easy anymore. So You combine all of these things, and the natural, obvious result is chaos. So that's what we've had for the last few years, is increasing instability around the world that can be financial, or can be political, or it can be both. And the amplitude is increasing. You know, each new crisis is bigger than the last. Each new credit bubble is bigger than the last. This one that we're in right now, James Turk and I called it the money bubble in the book we co-wrote a couple of years ago. And it's bigger than anything that's come before, because it's basically everywhere. It's government bonds around the world now yielding negative interest rates, and it's fiat currencies being created at double-digit rates everywhere, so the supply is soaring, and it's corporate debt at record levels as corporations borrow huge amounts of money in order to buy back their own stock. You know, and of course, it's consumer debt as people borrow more and more to put their kids through college and take out car mortgages where they encumber themselves for 7 years to buy a depreciating asset. You know, all of these things are combining to make life harder for people, and to make them more and more willing to vote for people who are going to tear the system up and start over. So you get this cycle of financial crisis leading to a political regime change, and the new people coming in want to make radical change, but not all the radical change works, you know, and some of it causes more trouble than it fixes. As with what Donald Trump is proposing, he's coming into office with some big plans. He's going to build up the military, a la Ronald Reagan. He's going to cut taxes, more or less the way Reagan did. And he's going to embark on a massive infrastructure spending program, the way the Democrats have been lobbying for forever. You know, Paul Krugman has been saying we need to do this for the last 10 or 15 years. We need to borrow huge amounts of money and then build new roads and fix our bridges and airports and things, and put people to work in the process. And so we're going to do it all at once. We're going to do it all with borrowed money. And then the government is going to lean on the Fed to finance it all by creating a lot of new currency. What could go wrong?
If there's more to it than just creating the currency, right? Because if you have no one to buy the Treasury bills or Treasury bonds, how does that play out? I mean, in the past few years, hasn't it been becoming increasingly difficult for the Treasury to even get anybody to buy the bonds, and now it's been the Federal Reserve themselves having to sop them up? I mean, how does that play out when you try to rapidly increase spending like that? Who's going to be actually putting up that money?
Well, the Fed can buy as many bonds as it wants to. It has an unlimited printing press. So in previous QE cycles, it's bought $80 billion a month or whatever. That's make-believe money. You know, it's just a mouse click. So these guys, if $80 billion wasn't enough in 2012, then let's make it $500 billion a month. And we'll just buy up everything the federal government can issue, which, by the way, means that the whole issuing bonds thing is a step that can be just skipped, right? You just have the Federal Reserve create money, give it straight to the government, and then the government runs itself off the Federal Reserve. And you don't actually even need to tax people in that kind of a world, right? You just finance the operation of the government completely with newly created money. Tax rates go to zero.
Yeah, well, because it's really a stealth tax, right? Because what you're actually doing is diluting the entire currency of the entire country and everyone who holds it.
Very good. Yes, it's a tax on the holders of the currency, who tend to be middle class and lower middle class people, right? Anybody who has a bank account is disadvantaged by that. Whereas if somebody has a portfolio of bonds that the government is actively buying up, then you make a profit. And if you have a bunch of stocks that all this newly created currency is flowing into because stock prices are going up, well, you make out then too. If you've got a London penthouse, you do well. If you've got Monets and Van Goghs on your wall, they go up in value. That's what happens in an inflationary period. Real stuff goes up in value relative to the currency that's being inflated away. Well, rich people own the real stuff, so they get richer and richer. Poor people and middle-class people tend to do their savings in local currency. They'll create a bank account or they'll keep some cash at home or whatever. And those are the guys who get hurt. Also, of course, their pension plans tend to suffer because pension plans don't do very well in times of instability, like we've seen for the last few years. Hedge funds are unable to beat the stock market, and pension plans are getting more and more underfunded because even with stocks going up, they just can't seem to keep ahead of their increasing obligations. So if you've got a pension, let's say you're a retired firefighter, and you've got a pension and you've got a bank account, you are screwed royally because your pension is going to run out of money. They're going to cut your benefits dramatically. Or the pension will continue to pay out benefits, but they'll raise taxes on everybody in sight in order to pay for it. So your taxes will go up. Your bank account will get less valuable, even though the number of dollars will still be the same in your account, but the value of each individual dollar will be dropping like a rock. And so you end up with less and less purchasing power over time, and the money you put away thinking that it was going to be enough to retire on turns out to be woefully inadequate, and you are eating dog food. You're one of those people that you read about as a cautionary tale. Don't let this happen to you. And it's going to be a lot of people, because 70 to 80% of the people in the U.S. are probably in this boat. And if you're one of those people, do you vote for the party that engineered the system that did this to you? Of course not. You vote for the guy who says, the system is rigged. I'm going to put those people in jail, and I'm going to give you a bunch of money. And so that's the political landscape of the future now.
So you've described how a Trump presidency will likely result in increased spending, and if lowered taxes, then increased debt. Do you see anything coming from what you've seen as far as campaign promises or any body language so far of the Trump position or platform that you think would reduce the risk of a dollar collapse, or is this just driving us faster than ever towards the cliff?
Yeah, it's important to understand that if Hillary Clinton was the president right now, she would be continuing the policies of the last 8 years, which is to say big deficits, aggressive money creation, a fairly big, expensive military empire that we're maintaining, largely deregulated banks that do anything they want to, and interest rates that are being pushed further and further into negative territory. That would be our reality going forward. And that's also a recipe for disasters. So it's not that Trump's policies are especially incompetent. It's that we've reached the point where there's no solution for this much debt. You can only inflate it away by creating a whole bunch of currency and doing what we just described to the people who trust you and save in that local currency. Or you can just have a 1930s style depression where everybody goes bankrupt and their debt gets wiped out because they just stop paying on it, and all their stuff gets taken away. But that's pretty much it. We don't really have any other choices. Used to be back in the imperialist days, where you'd go take over another country and loot it of all its wealth, but there's nobody left to take over now.
So how do you see this? How do you see this playing out? Then you've kind of painted a pretty bleak picture. And if someone, what do you think is a realistic scenario? We've had guests on talking about a series of crises versus one major collapse. Your site, thedollarcollapse.com. Do you have what you believe to be the most probable scenario, or is it just too complex and there's just too many different ways that it can go?
Well, there are lots of different ways it can go because we don't know what the choices are going to be going forward necessarily. As I said, there are two different ways to wipe out this debt, and which of them we end up with depends largely on the choices that are made going forward. But it seems pretty clear that we're committed to trying to inflate away the debt. Every major country is doing it. Japan is creating more debt at the government level than anybody ever has as a percent of GDP. And they've pushed interest rates down across the yield curve into negative territory. That's an aggressive attempt to devalue the yen. China is taking on immense amounts of debt, maybe more debt in nominal terms than anybody's ever taken on before. And they're devaluing the yuan pretty aggressively here. It's at a 6-year low. The U.S., of course, obviously, is looking at massive increases in government spending and money creation. And that's inflationary. That those policies are ultimately designed to lower the value of the currency. And Europe, of course, is in danger of spinning out of control, with the obvious solution being for Germany to tell the European Central Bank to devalue the euro really aggressively as a way of keeping Italy and Greece and Portugal and Spain in the eurozone, because otherwise they can't function. If the euro is too strong, those cultures just can't manage. But if the euro is devalued aggressively, maybe they can function. Maybe they can create enough new jobs via cheap exports to allow themselves to stay in the eurozone. And if that's Germany's ultimate goal, that's the only possible solution, devalue the euro really aggressively. So basically, you have everybody under pressure to devalue their currencies. They're choosing slightly different paths, each of them, but similar enough that it's all part of the same easy money toolbox. It's just a matter of emphasis. One country's spending more money at the governmental level. Some other country is increasing currency aggressively or devaluing their currency aggressively. It's all the same thing in the end. It all ends up with a cheaper currency at the expense of trading partners. Now, the only conceivable, relatively pain-free way, nothing is completely pain-free, but the least painful way of dealing with this comes from Jim Rickards, who makes a prediction that at some point, everybody's going to figure out that it's a zero-sum game to devalue against each other, right? And so they're going to look around for something else to devalue against, and they'll find out that it's gold, the form of money that has existed for 3,000 years and has worked really well up until 1971. And everybody will get together, go to a modified global gold standard, devalue their currencies against gold, and in that way, wipe out a big chunk of their debt. So that kind of accelerates the process we're talking about of screwing over the regular guy who saved a lot of money in his bank account, because your dollars become a lot less valuable if the dollar is suddenly redefined as 1/10,000th of an ounce of gold. But it does have the advantage of creating what might be a stable monetary system going forward. So as we transition to a gold standard of some sort, then everybody has to live within their means, more or less, again, which means governments have to give up the power just to create as much new currency as they want to. And it's going to take a crisis to get them to that point. But at that point, then government spending and the propensity of governments to encourage the private sector to get into huge amounts of debt is going to be limited, because your currency is linked to gold and it's exchangeable with gold. So if somebody wants to turn their dollars in for gold, you got to give them dollars, you got to give them gold. And if you run out of gold, then your system breaks down. So you can't let that happen. So you have to control the supply of dollars that you're creating. So that's what we would have going forward. But getting from here to there, messy and painful, almost certainly.
Well, it seems to be that there's at least three potential losers in that scenario. And I'm wondering, I understand how one of those classes of losers is defenseless, but I'm curious about the other two and how that makes it a realistic or unrealistic scenario. The first class of losers is the common person who is retirees, low income to lower middle income people who have some savings in cash and pensions and that sort of thing. So all of those people, as you mentioned before, because their meager net worth is denominated in currency, are going to be losers because the currency is going to be significantly devalued. That's class number one. Mm-hmm. Class number two would be, if you're going to inflate away your debt, then the holder of that debt is going to is come out as a loser, unless there's some double reverse trickery and I wouldn't put it past, because it's hard to put your mind around some of these things. But why wouldn't the holder, in this case the Fed or whoever's holding all those bonds, be the big losers if they're holding hundreds of trillions of dollars that are of IOUs to the government? The government says, yeah, I'll pay you back in these worthless dollars. And then the third class would be the governments who have been intoxicated with their power that comes from the unlimited ability to create money out of thin air and to do all these massive programs and things like that, suddenly find themselves, their hands and feet tied, because they're limited by reality now and they can only spend what their actual gold will permit them. So could you address this? How why should not we believe that this scenario that you've just described could never really come to be, because these two hugely powerful groups would never give up the kind of power that they get from keeping the game going as it is now?
Well, that's why it hasn't happened yet, because these guys don't want to give up this power. This is just paradise for politicians, this world, because throughout human history, if a politician wanted to do something big that was expensive, they had to actually go get the money from somewhere. And that meant gold coins. They had to go get gold from somewhere. And frequently that meant, taking it in a way that made a lot of people so mad that it almost wasn't worth doing the thing they were trying to do. Or borrowing money from banks at exorbitant rates that would bankrupt the government at some point in the not too distant future, and so it was hard to be a politician back then. Now it's easy. You just promise everything to every constituency. And once you're in office, you just spend the money that it takes to give it to these guys. You borrow whatever you have to borrow above your tax revenues, and then you have the Federal Reserve cover the interest costs by creating new currency. So we have a whole generation of politicians who have never had to say no to a major constituency. And they don't have the skill, because they've never had to do it. They've never had to develop the skill to prioritize. They just have no idea how to do something like that. So that's why these guys are so baffled by what's happening in the world, because in their world, in their experience, and they're 60 years old. It's been that way since they were 20, when they were interns in Washington, or brand new lawyers or whatever. Their world involves promising stuff to people, putting together a coalition that's big enough to get 51% of the vote, and then after the election, giving the stuff to the people you promised with borrowed money. You can't do that in a world where your currency is just another name for a certain weight of gold. And that's the power they would have to give up. So, of course, they don't want to do it. They think it's crazy. And they have all these economic theories that justify their self-interest. Now, about what happens to the bond markets in an inflationary period when we're devaluing our currencies really aggressively. Yeah. If you own a Treasury bond and the dollar becomes 2/3 less valuable in real terms, then the income stream from that bond is also worth 2/3 less. And the bond itself is therefore worth 2/3 less. So you make a huge loss on your bond portfolio. That's bad for instance, pension funds, of course, and it's bad for individuals with bond funds in their IRAs or whatever. But it doesn't matter at all to the Fed, because the Fed just makes money out of thin air. So if it takes a loss on its bond portfolio, it just created the money out of thin air to buy the bonds in the first place. So it doesn't even really matter. Probably one of the things we'll do on the way to this ultimate gold standard nirvana, somewhere in the decade hence future, we'll probably have the central banks of the world just forgive all the government debt that they've bought. So it'll be, a government debt jubilee for itself, because they can do that. They bought it with make-believe money, and so they can just take it out of the books, just write it off, and it's gone. And nobody got any poorer because of that, because the money was never real to begin with. It was all just created in a computer and moved from one database to another.
But during the Great Depression, where my folks grew up at that time, and they were very bitter about the wealth transfer that happened when, because of the collapse of the markets, so many people went under financially that the banks seized the physical assets. They seized the farm land, and they seized people's homes, and they seized whatever possessions they had. So I get lost when it sounds unrealistically idealistic to think that there'll be this big debt holiday and everybody just gets off scot-free, rather than there would be this huge wealth transfer, and whoever had been who was holding the IOU tickets of saying that they were the debt holders all along, when people, governments and others are unable to pay the debt, why would they not seize their lands and any other national assets and so on in lieu of payment of the debts?
Oh, no, because if we had a 1930s style deflationary crash where huge numbers of people defaulted on their debt, then yeah, you would have banks seizing farms and the repo man coming to take your house and your car away and everything. That's what that process would be. But if we inflate away the value of the currency, then people won't be defaulting on their loans all over the place, so you won't have banks coming in to seize your assets. Your bank account just won't be worth much anymore, and so it's sort of a secret, silent way to steal money from people, inflating away the currency.
So in preparation for that, then you should own some hard assets that you could at that point liquidate for this cheap currency and pay off your debt easily.
Yeah, because they can't make any more farmland the way they can make new dollars.
What hard assets do you, from the dollarcollapse.com perspective, consider to be some of the ones that people should consider the most seriously?
Oh, the easiest one is precious metals, because anybody can go out and buy some silver coins. It's not easy to buy farmland or a rental house or something like that. You really need to think that through, and then you need to be there to take care of it. But you can take that same money and go buy some silver coins and then store them in a safe place, or some gold coins if you've got more money. And they will tend to behave the same way financially as farmland does, or as Van Gogh or something like that. They'll go up in value because the unit of measure, the local fiat currency, is going down in value. So it won't be that your gold coins suddenly develop some new aspect that makes them more valuable. It's just that the thing we're measuring them with, the dollar, will be losing value. So the value of an individual gold coin, which hasn't changed in real terms, will go up in dollar terms. So that's one way to preserve your purchasing power. Mining stocks are, if you're a little bit more financially literate and up for a little bit of action in the financial markets, then gold and silver miners are great proxies for gold and silver. They're much more leveraged, though. They go up more and they go down more than the underlying metal, and they need to be well chosen. 90% of gold and silver miners will go out of business, but if you pick one of the good ones, if gold doubles, that miner might go up by 5 times or more. I've seen quite a few, and sold many way too soon because they just kept on going up and up and up during bull markets in precious metals. So if you choose mining stocks well, you can not just preserve your purchasing power, but you can make a ton of money. I wouldn't say jump in with both feet into a precious metals miner portfolio, but it's a thing to do after you've settled your base money part of your portfolio. In other words, got some gold and silver coins, or buy some other real assets that are going to hold up pretty well in the coming attempt to devalue the currency. Then you can move on to things like precious metal stocks and other resource-related stocks. A lot of commodities will go up in an inflationary boom. If we have the Austrian School of Economics crack-up boom, which is basically just a period when people lose faith in the currency and dump it by converting it into real assets at pretty much any price for a while, then pretty much any real asset goes up. So if you're diversified into real assets, some oil stocks and maybe some solar power stocks or something like that, some real estate of some sort, some precious metals, you'll probably be okay if the inflationary scenario plays out as the governments of the world hope that it will. There's no guarantee that that's the case, but it's the most likely scenario, and that kind of a portfolio would protect you from the worst of the really crazy stuff when it starts happening.
Well, John, you've done a lot of research on this. You've done a lot of writing on this. If people want to take advantage of more of your current analysis as things move forward in these very volatile and eventful times, where can they continue to keep in touch with your work?
Well, I run dollarcollapse.com, which is a site that updates this kind of thing continuously. And my most recent book is called The Money Bubble, and it's available on dollarcollapse.com and also on amazon.com.
And I just realized I forgot to ask you the other question I was going to ask you, which is about Edward Snowden and the surveillance state. Or do we have the opportunity here for some human empowerment and liberty in face of the surveillance state? Beyond all of these economic and political turmoils, what about the loss of privacy on the individual level, and what can an individual person do to protect their privacy and reclaim their rights to free speech and freedom?
Yeah, technology has changed everything as far as privacy goes. We can't assume that we're ever really beyond surveillance now, because they can turn your phone on, even if you've turned it off, and use it as a mic to listen in on your calls. They can read your emails. They can monitor your landline calls, obviously. They could be listening in on this conversation right now, Dunnigan, and there's nothing we can do about it. Or there's nothing the average person can do about it, because it's too technically complicated to completely exempt yourself from all the surveillance that goes on out there. But what Edward Snowden was saying was that there are technologies that are coming along that make it possible to give yourself a measure of privacy. And it takes a little bit of sophistication to figure them out, but they're getting simpler and cheaper all the time. So there's kind of an arms race going on between the surveillance state, which wants to listen in on everything all the time, and individuals and other actors in the world who would like to be left alone at least some of the time, and so there are going to be email services, for instance, that don't give all your information to the government, and websites that refuse to cooperate with the NSA, and cell phone services that are much harder to tap than the ones that we have now. That stuff is either here or coming. So if we care about privacy, we can't expect the government to take care of us and protect us, because it seems that no matter who's in office, they just want to be Big Brother. George W. Bush started this thing, and Barack Obama, in many ways, was even worse and more aggressive about surveillance than George W. Bush was. So it's wishful thinking to hope that Trump is going to be better than either of those two guys. So we have to do it ourselves. And Snowden offered some technical ideas, which are way beyond my expertise. I wouldn't even want to try to explain them. But he said they're there, and they're being developed, and it's possible now. So to the extent that we really care about this, we have options now. We have a chance to carve out little islands of privacy in our lives. And I think it's a good idea for us to start looking into that now, because the time may come when it's not just an annoyance, that they're reading your email or whatever, and it becomes a life or death issue. And we need to be ready for it when and if that happens.
Well, we've certainly seen during the hotly contested political system how fragile the security around emails can be, and also the increased level of scrutiny that even postings such as alternative media, such as this channel and others, have been under, on the alternative media, being declared not advertiser friendly, that sort of thing. So there's certainly an increased scrutiny, an increased intrusiveness, increased pressure to moderate the content of what our communication is, and some people have really had to take a hard stand of just opting out of a lot of platforms that they would have been on, because they just simply can't have the freedom of speech that they need in order to just to fulfill their mission. And I don't know if you've experienced any of those kinds of pressures on the dollarcollapse.com, or in any of your speaking at events or in writing or anything, or have you not been something you've encountered or talked with people who've encountered, is this sense of censorship in our current age?
No, I haven't experienced anything. It's probable that nobody cares what I have to say, which is fine. But I think there's a decent chance that it's not noticeable until it really matters. Mm-hmm. And then, something happens, and then somebody from the government slaps down some big file in front of you and says, here, look, back in 2014, you said this in an email, and there it is right there, your entire electronic communication life for the past decade. So, and that's the kind of thing that anybody who's politically active, for instance, has got to be thinking about. Because whatever government's in charge, of course, they're going to surveil their opponents, right, and build files and stuff. And we've been doing this since the FBI under J. Edgar Hoover. Right. So with these new toys, you got to think they're doing it now. So I don't know. It's the whole turnkey totalitarian state thing is terrifying. We've built the capabilities of a police state into the system. And it's just waiting for somebody to take it over. And, here we've handed it to Donald Trump. This is going to be interesting.
One last question before I let you go, and that is, in the scenario where there's a hyperinflation and devaluation of the currency, but people who are holders of precious metals such as gold and silver coins should come out okay, or at least somewhat hedged against that catastrophe. What do you think, in your opinion, is the likelihood of some disproportionate, new taxation or law or something that just basically pulls the rug out from right underneath you, your best laid plans, of trying to protect yourself, and here you are just subject to windfall profits on your precious metals or something like that? Just like people wouldn't have seen bail-ins of their pension plans or whatever their other bank accounts coming until it happened. You got to be kidding me, kind of thing. That was my savings. Now it's the government's, or it's the banks. What do you think is the risk of, because we hear a lot of people asking about, confiscation, 1933 style of precious metal. No, nobody's going to go door to door confiscating your metals. Well, fine, maybe they don't have to if they just tax your profits out from underneath you.
Yeah, I mean, the risk of stuff like this is huge. And there's no way to know what specifically they'll do, but there's also the technological risk of the financial markets just shutting down for a while, which has happened in the past. And now we've got cyber war on top of everything else. Making it possible. So you want to diversify. You respond to uncertainty by diversifying, and you respond to extreme uncertainty with extreme diversification. And that means, move some money overseas if you can. Set up a bank account in another country, or contract with a precious metal storage company in Hong Kong or Singapore or Switzerland, and have them store some of your precious metals. Own a couple of pieces of real estate if you can. Own equities in 2 or 3 different accounts with different brokerage houses. So trouble at one brokerage house doesn't freeze your entire account. Keep some cash on hand. Even though you don't trust cash, it's liable to come in handy. Have some. And on and on. There are a dozen different ways to diversify your financial life. And now's a pretty good time to look into most of them, because the crazier things get, the higher the likelihood of something, as you said, coming out of left field that in some way impairs some part of your financial life. So you don't want that to be the end of your financial life. You want to have other stuff elsewhere that you can draw on when the time comes.
Well, John Rubino, founder of DollarCollapse.com, thanks so much again for joining us here on Reluctant Preppers.
Thanks, Donegan.